The candles in the great hall had not yet been lit when Duke Alaric Bennington stood before the assembled household and told his wife, in front of every servant she had come to know by name, that their marriage was over. Elara Whitmore stood very still. She did not reach for the back of a chair, though her knees wanted to bend. She did not look at the housekeeper, whose face had gone pale, or at the young footman who had dropped a tray somewhere behind her, the clatter swallowed by the silence that followed the Duke's words. "You will remove to the Dower House by the end of the week," Alaric said. His voice was even, the voice of a man reading out a decision he had already made days ago, perhaps weeks ago, in some room she had never been invited into. "It is not a punishment, it is simply the truth of things. This marriage has given this house nothing. No air, no warmth, no purpose I can name." Elara heard the words land, one after another, like stones dropped into still water. 5 years. 5 years of rising before the rest of the house woke, of sitting in the cold estate office long after the fires had been banked, of catching a steward's false entries and quietly, patiently, correcting what no one had asked her to correct. 5 years, and he stood there and said the marriage had given the house nothing. She looked past him instead, at the tall windows where the last gray light of the afternoon was fading over the park, and she thought of the ledger locked in the bottom of her writing desk, wrapped in a shawl no one would think to lift. "As you wish, Your Grace," she said. It was all she said. She had learned, over 5 years, that arguing with Alaric Bennington was like arguing with a closed door. He did not hear what he had already decided not to hear. The Dowager Duchess, seated near the fire with her embroidery frame untouched in her lap, allowed herself the smallest curve of satisfaction at the corner of her mouth. She had wanted this outcome since the wedding day, since the moment she had first looked at the quiet, unremarkable girl her son had married for her modest fortune and her family's old name, and found nothing in her worth keeping. "You will want your things packed sensibly," the Dowager said, as though she were discussing the weather. "The Dower House is small. There will not be room for excess." Elara inclined her head. "I have very little that requires room, Your Grace." She turned then and walked from the hall, her spine straight, her steps unhurried, though inside her chest something had gone tight and cold, like a hand closing slowly around a small flame and refusing to let it breathe. Upstairs, in the chamber that had been hers alone for the last 2 years, since Alaric had stopped visiting even out of duty, she closed the door and stood with her back against it for a long moment. Then she crossed to the writing desk, knelt before it, and drew out the shawl-wrapped bundle from its hidden compartment beneath the false bottom of the lowest drawer. The ledger was heavier than it looked. 5 years of entries, in her own careful hand, filled its pages from the first cover to nearly the last. She did not open it. She knew every line of it already, the way a person knows the shape of their own hand. It had begun, as such things often do, with a small mistake that refused to sit quietly in her mind. In the first months of her marriage, when Alaric had still spoken to her at dinner, still asked after her day even if he did not truly listen to the answer, Elara had been given the ordinary duties expected of a new duchess. She oversaw the household accounts, the linen inventories, the wages of the maids and footmen, small, unremarkable tasks that no one imagined could matter. But numbers had always made sense to her in a way that people rarely did, and one evening, checking a column of figures for the kitchen expenditures against the tradesmen's receipts, she had found that the totals did not agree, not by a great deal, a few pounds, no more. The kind of discrepancy a careless clerk might explain away as an error in addition. She had mentioned it, once, to the estate steward, a heavy-set man named Mr. Pratt who had served the Bennington family for over a decade, and was trusted absolutely, by everyone, including Alaric, who had never once thought to question him. Mr. Pratt had smiled at her, the smile of a man speaking to a foolish child, and told her that household accounts were often untidy, that she should not trouble her pretty head with figures better left to men who understood such things. Elara had said nothing more to him, but she had not stopped looking. Over the months that followed, the discrepancies did not disappear. They grew, slowly, patiently, the way weeds grow in a garden no one is watching closely enough to tend. A few pounds here, a slightly larger sum there. Rents from tenant farms that seemed to shrink slightly on their way from the fields to the estate ledgers, though the harvests themselves were good. Repairs billed at prices that made no sense for the work described. She began, quietly, to keep her own record, not to replace the official books, which remained in Mr. Pratt's careful, confident hand, but to track beside them, in a private ledger of her own, what she believed the true figures ought to be. She cross-checked tradesmen's receipts herself. She wrote out, when she could find reason to, and spoke with tenant families directly. learning what rents they had actually paid and comparing the sums against what appeared in the estate books. It was tedious work, done in stolen hours, always alone, always hidden. She told no one, not even Alaric, especially not Alaric, because she had tried, in the second year of her marriage, to raise the subject with him directly, and he had waved her concern away with the same easy dismissal Mr. Pratt had shown her. "Pratt has managed this estate since before I was born," Alaric had said, not even looking up from the letter he was writing. "I trust him a great deal more than I trust a woman's reading of a column of numbers." That had been the last time she tried to tell him anything that mattered. So she had continued alone. She corrected what she could correct quietly, paying certain bills herself from her own modest allowance rather than let discrepancies compound, smoothing over shortfalls before they could be noticed by anyone who might ask uncomfortable questions. She was not naive enough to believe she was solving the problem. She knew, with the clear-eyed certainty of someone who had studied the pattern for years, that Mr. Pratt was taking money that did not belong to him, steadily, carefully, in amounts small enough to escape notice from a man who had never once looked closely at his own accounts. She had not exposed him, partly because she had no proof that would satisfy a husband who did not wish to be convinced, partly, if she was honest with herself in the dark hours before sleep, because some quiet, wounded part of her had wanted to see how long it would take him to notice on his own that something was wrong in his own house, something beyond the coldness of his marriage. He had never noticed. Not the missing money, not the woman standing quietly behind the numbers, holding the whole fragile structure together with her own two hands. Now she knelt on the floor of a room that would no longer be hers, holding a ledger that contained the truth of 5 years, and she felt something she had not expected to feel. Not grief, though grief was there too, buried somewhere beneath the surface, something closer to a strange, exhausted relief. She would not beg him to see her. She would not stay in this house and continue to hold up walls for a man who had just told the entire household she had given him nothing. She wrapped the ledger back in its shawl and packed it, without ceremony, at the very bottom of the single trunk she was permitted to take with her, beneath her plainest gowns, where no one would think to look. By the time the maid came to help her finish packing, Alara's face had settled into the same calm, unreadable expression she had worn for years in this house, the expression that had made the dowager call her dull, and made Alaric call her nothing at all. Only her hands, folding a shawl she did not need to fold, betrayed the faintest tremor. Outside, the last light was gone from the windows. Somewhere below, she could hear Mr. Pratt's voice, low and pleased, speaking with the dowager near the fire. Already, she suspected, beginning to plan how much easier his work would become once the one person in the house who watched the numbers too closely was gone. He did not know what she was taking with her. Neither did Alaric. A soft knock came at the door before Alara could gather her thoughts further. It was Marjorie, the young housemaid who had served her since the first year of her marriage, the only person in the household who had ever looked at her with something like genuine warmth rather than polite indifference. "I have brought your traveling cloak, Your Grace," Marjorie said, her eyes red at the edges, though she was clearly trying to hide it, "and I have asked cook to prepare a basket for the journey. It is not far to the dower house, but the roads are poor this time of year." "Thank you, Marjorie." Alara took the cloak and folded it carefully over her arm. "You need not trouble yourself further tonight." "It is no trouble." The girl hesitated, twisting her hands in her apron. "Begging your pardon, Your Grace, but the whole house knows this is not right. Whatever His Grace believes, we know how early you rise, and how late you sit in that cold office going over figures no one asked you to look at. We are not blind, even if some in this house choose to be." Alara felt something tighten in her throat, unexpected and unwelcome. She had grown so accustomed to being unseen that even this small acknowledgement struck her harder than she wished to admit. "You are kind to say so, but it changes nothing tonight." "No, Your Grace. I suppose it does not." Marjorie dropped a small curtsy and slipped from the room, leaving Alara once more alone with her trunk and her thoughts. She sat on the edge of the narrow bed, the cloak still draped over her arm, and allowed herself, for the first time since the great hall had gone silent around her, a single unsteady breath. Not tears. She would not permit herself tears, not tonight, not in this house where every closed door still had ears pressed against it. But the breath came out shaking all the same, and she pressed her palm flat against her chest, as though she could hold her own heart still by force. 5 years ago she had arrived in this house a bride of 19, uncertain and hopeful, believing that a marriage arranged for practical reasons might still, in time, grow into something warmer. She had learned quickly how mistaken that hope had been. She had learned to fill the silence of her marriage with numbers instead, with columns of figures that made sense even when the man across the dinner table did not. She had told herself, more than once, that the ledger was simply a way to be useful in a house that had no other use for her. Only now, kneeling by her trunk in the fading light, did she let herself admit the fuller truth. She had kept the ledger not only to be useful, she had kept it because it was hers, entirely hers, a small private kingdom no one else had thought to claim, in a life where almost nothing else belonged to her alone. She rose, finally, and crossed to the window one last time. Below, in the courtyard, a carriage was already being readied for the morning, its lamps unlit, its horses stabled for the night. Tomorrow she would leave this house as a woman set aside, dismissed before the household as dull and without purpose. She looked down at her own hands, ink stained faintly at the fingertips despite her best efforts to scrub the marks away after each late night at the estate desk, and she thought of everything those hands had quietly held together without a single word of thanks. Let them believe what they wished to believe. She knew what she carried in that trunk, wrapped beneath her plainest gowns, and she knew that the truth, once it surfaced, would not care who had chosen to look away from it. Alara closed the trunk, latched it, and allowed herself, for one private moment, a small and bitter smile. Let them think her dismissed. Let them think her defeated. She had spent 5 years learning exactly how this house worked, in ways neither her husband nor his steward had ever cared to notice, and she had not spent that knowledge yet. She had only just begun to carry it away. The dower house smelled of dust and old lavender when Alara arrived the following afternoon, the carriage wheels crunching to a stop on a gravel path overgrown with weeds no one had bothered to clear in years. It was smaller than she had expected, though she had known, in a distant way, that it would be. A modest stone house at the edge of the estate, half hidden behind a stand of elm trees, kept in reserve for widowed dowagers and, apparently, for wives no longer wanted. The housekeeper who greeted her, a thin woman named Mrs. Fenwick, seemed startled to have a guest at all, as though the house had not truly expected to be lived in again so soon. "We were told only yesterday to prepare rooms, Your Grace," Mrs. Fenwick said, wringing her hands slightly as she led Alara through a narrow hallway. "Forgive the state of things. There has not been much notice." "There rarely is, in my experience," Alara said, and meant it more than the housekeeper could know. Her rooms were plain but clean, a bedchamber and a small sitting room with a writing desk beneath a window that looked out over an unkempt garden. It was, Alara thought as she set down her single trunk, very much like the rest of her life in the Bennington household. Quiet, overlooked. Made to serve a purpose no one troubled to explain to her directly. She did not unpack the ledger that first evening. She sat instead by the window as the light faded, watching the garden grow dim, and let her mind drift backward, the way it so often did now, to the beginning of a marriage that had promised so little and delivered even less. She had been 19 when the match was arranged, her family respectable but not wealthy, her father eager to see her settled with a title that would secure whatever remained of their standing. Alaric had been 23, recently come into his dukedom after his father's sudden death, and in need, his mother had insisted, of a sensible wife who would bring order rather than scandal to a household still finding its footing. Alara remembered the wedding only in fragments now, the weight of unfamiliar jewels at her throat, the dowager's assessing gaze, moving over her as though pricing a horse at market. Alaric himself, handsome and distant even on that first day, speaking his vows in a voice that held no more warmth than a man reading aloud from a legal document. She had told herself, in those early weeks, that warmth would come with time. That was what everyone said, after all, about arranged matches. Given patience, given effort, affection could grow where it had not been planted. She had brought patience. She had brought effort, more than she suspected he ever noticed. What she had not accounted for was the dowager's determination that no affection should be permitted to grow at all. It began small, as such things often do. A comment at dinner about Alara's plain manner of dress, delivered lightly enough that objecting to it would have seemed petty. A remark to Alaric, made just within Alara's hearing, about how some brides brought liveliness to a house and others brought only silence. A steady, patient campaign, carried out over months and then years, to convince her son that his wife was exactly as dull and unremarkable as his mother had always insisted she would be. Alara had tried, in the first year, to defend herself against these small cuts. She had learned quickly that defending herself only gave the dowager more material to work with, more evidence to present to Alaric of a wife who argued, who made scenes, who could not simply accept her place with grace. So she had stopped defending herself. She had gone quiet instead, and the quiet had been mistaken, exactly as the dowager intended, for dullness. It was in that first year, buried in the ordinary duties of managing household accounts, that she had first noticed the discrepancies in the estate books. She remembered the exact evening clearly, more clearly than she remembered her own wedding day. A ledger opened before her at the desk in the small office she had been given, a column of kitchen expenditures that would not balance no matter how many times she added the figures. She had checked her own arithmetic 3 times before concluding, with a kind of quiet dread, that the error was not hers at all. She had gone to Mr. Pratt the following morning, carrying the ledger with her, expecting he would simply correct an honest clerical mistake. Instead, she had found herself dismissed with a smile so practiced it had taken her months to fully understand what it meant. "You are new to these matters, Your Grace," he had said, in a tone that managed to be perfectly respectful, while somehow suggesting she was a child who had wandered into a room meant for adults. "Household books rarely balance to the penny. It is nothing to trouble yourself over." She had wanted to believe him. It would have been easier, certainly, to believe him. But something in the careless confidence of his explanation had not sat right with her, and rather than let the matter go, she had begun, quietly, to watch. Over the following months she noticed more. A shipment of coal that arrived smaller than the invoice claimed. Tenant rents recorded in the estate books that did not match, when she found occasion to ask discreetly what the tenants themselves reported paying. Repairs to the eastern wing billed at sums that seemed impossibly high for work she could see, with her own eyes, had been done cheaply and hastily. None of it was large enough, on its own, to draw attention. That, she came to understand, was precisely the point. Mr. Pratt was not a foolish man. He had built his scheme slowly, over years of trusted service, taking just enough to enrich himself steadily, without ever taking so much that anyone troubled to look closely. Alara had looked closely. She had nothing else, in those early years, to occupy the long hours of a marriage that offered her little companionship and less warmth. The numbers, at least, made sense. The numbers did not dismiss her with a practiced smile or measure her worth against a mother-in-law's cutting remarks. The numbers simply were what they were, waiting patiently for someone willing to look. She began her private ledger almost by accident, jotting corrected figures into a spare notebook one evening simply to satisfy her own mind that she was not imagining the discrepancies. It grew, over months, into something more deliberate. She cross-referenced tradesmen's bills against household stores. She rode out to speak with tenant families when Alaric was occupied elsewhere, learning the true sums of rents paid and comparing them, with growing certainty, against what appeared in Mr. Pratt's careful books. She told Alaric once, in the second year of her marriage, on an evening when he seemed, briefly, inclined to listen. She remembered the exact words she had used, chosen carefully to sound measured rather than accusing, and she remembered exactly how quickly he had waved them away. "Pratt has served this family since I was a boy," he had said, barely glancing up from his own correspondence. "I would sooner trust his judgment in these matters than concern myself with household arithmetic. It is not a fitting occupation for a duchess in any case." She had not raised the subject again, not because she believed herself wrong, but because she understood, with painful clarity, that being right would not matter to a man who had already decided what he wished to believe. So she had continued alone, quietly correcting what she could, paying certain shortfalls from her own modest allowance rather than let them compound into problems someone might eventually notice and blame on mismanagement elsewhere. She told herself this was simply prudence, simply the sensible behavior of a woman protecting a household that was, whatever else it lacked, still her home. Sitting now in the fading light of the dower house, 5 years and 1 dismissal later, Alara allowed herself to admit a harder truth. She had not only been protecting the household. Some quiet, wounded part of her had also been waiting all those years for the moment someone would finally notice what she had done. For Alaric to look up from his correspondence and see her, truly see her, not as a dull and unremarkable wife, but as the person who had spent years quietly holding his house together while he looked everywhere except toward her. That moment had never come. Instead, he had stood before the household and told them all she had given him nothing. A soft knock came at the sitting-room door, startling her from her thoughts. Mrs. Fenwick entered with a small tray of tea and bread, apologizing again for the plainness of the fare, explaining that the dower house had not been provisioned for a guest of such standing on such short notice. "It is more than sufficient," Alara assured her, and found, to her mild surprise, that she meant it. There was something almost restful in the plainness of the house, in the absence of the dowager's watchful eyes, and Alaric's cool indifference. For the first time in longer than she could easily remember, she was simply alone, unobserved, free to sit with her own thoughts without the constant awareness of being measured and found wanting. That night, once Mrs. Fenwick had retired and the house had gone quiet, Ilara finally opened her trunk and drew out the ledger, unwrapping it from its shawl and setting it on the small writing desk beneath the window. She did not open it. Not yet. She simply rested her hand on its worn leather cover, feeling the weight of 5 years of careful, hidden work beneath her palm, and allowed herself to wonder, for the first time since leaving the main house, what she intended to do with it now. She had not brought it out of spite, though she could not deny that some bitter satisfaction lived in the thought of Alaric one day learning the truth. She had brought it because it was hers, the one thing in 5 years of marriage that belonged entirely to her, built by her own hands out of hours no one else had valued. What she did with it now, she realized, sitting alone in the quiet dark of a house meant for forgotten wives, was entirely her own choice to make. For the first time in 5 years, no one stood over her shoulder to tell her otherwise. Outside, an owl called once across the overgrown garden, and Ilara sat a long while longer in the dark, the ledger beneath her hand, before she finally rose and went to bed. Sleep did not come easily. She lay beneath unfamiliar blankets, listening to the unfamiliar creak of an unfamiliar house, and found her mind returning, as it so often did in quiet hours, to a memory she rarely allowed herself to visit. It was from the 2nd month of her marriage, before she had learned to expect so little. She had risen early one morning, unable to sleep, and had gone down to the breakfast room to find Alaric already there, reading correspondence with a cup of chocolate cooling untouched beside him. For a moment, before he noticed her, she had watched him in the gray morning light, and had thought, with the foolish hope of a new bride, that perhaps this was a man she could come to know. "You are up early," he had said, glancing up briefly. "I could not sleep." Nor I. He had returned to his letters almost immediately, and she had taken a seat across from him, pouring her own tea, waiting for him to say something more. He had not. After a few minutes of silence, he had risen, gathered his correspondence, and excused himself to his study, leaving her alone at the table with a full pot of tea, and the growing understanding that this, perhaps, was simply how her marriage would be. She had not known then how right that understanding would prove. Small silences, repeated daily, had hardened over months into a permanent distance, until conversation between them had become a formality reserved for guests and public occasions, performed carefully enough that no one outside the household would suspect how little warmth remained behind closed doors. The dowager, for her part, had never needed to work hard to widen that distance. She had simply needed to be patient, offering her opinions in small doses, always delivered with enough plausible concern that Alaric rarely questioned them. Ilara remembered one particular evening, perhaps a year into her marriage, when the dowager had remarked, in front of several dinner guests, that she supposed some wives simply were not suited to lively company, and that quiet women often made for restful households, if not especially interesting ones. The guests had laughed politely. Alaric had not defended her. Ilara had smiled, as she always did, and said nothing, and had gone upstairs later that night to sit alone at her writing desk, correcting a column of figures in the estate ledger, until the ache in her chest had quieted enough to let her sleep. It occurred to her now, lying in the dark of the dower house, how much of her marriage she had survived precisely this way, not by fighting the small cruelties directed at her, but by turning her attention elsewhere, into work no one valued but that at least belonged entirely to her. The ledger had not only tracked a steward's theft, it had, in its own quiet way, kept her steady through 5 years of being told, in 100 small ways, that she did not matter. She thought, too, of the tenant families she had visited over the years, ostensibly to check on rents and repairs, though in truth those visits had become something she looked forward to in a life with very few things to look forward to. The Hargrove family, at the eastern edge of the estate, always offered her tea and honest conversation, treating her not as a distant duchess to be flattered, but as a person whose questions deserved careful answers. It was old Mrs. Hargrove who had first mentioned, almost in passing, that the rent she paid each quarter seemed to have crept upward over the years in ways that did not match the modest improvements made to her cottage. That single offhand remark, more than any column of figures, had convinced Ilara she was not imagining a pattern. From that day, she had begun visiting other tenants as well, gathering small pieces of the truth one conversation at a time, building a private understanding of the estate's finances more accurate than anything recorded in Mr. Pratt's official books. She wondered now, staring up at the unfamiliar ceiling of the dower house, what had become of that trust. She had left the estate without a word to any of the tenant families who had spoken so openly with her over the years. She hoped, distantly, that they would not think she had abandoned them, though she supposed, given how suddenly her own household had abandoned her, they might understand better than most. Eventually, exhaustion overtook her thoughts, and she slept, though her dreams, when they came, were filled with columns of figures that would not balance no matter how many times she tried to add them, and a locked door that would not open no matter how firmly she knocked. She woke the next morning to pale sunlight filtering through unfamiliar curtains, and for one disoriented moment, before memory returned fully, she forgot entirely where she was. Then it came back to her, all at once. The great hall, the dowager's satisfaction, the long carriage ride to a house meant for forgotten wives. Elara rose, dressed without assistance, since Mrs. Fenwick had not yet arranged for a proper lady's maid, and stood for a long moment at the window of her small sitting room, looking out over the overgrown garden in the morning light. Somewhere beyond the trees, the main house stood exactly as it always had, its accounts once again unwatched, its steward once again free to work without the quiet interference of a wife no one had thought worth listening to. She wondered how long it would take before the numbers began to show it. 3 weeks after Elara left the main house, Duke Alaric Bennington sat at his father's old desk in the estate office and stared at a column of figures that refused to make sense. It was the quarterly report of tenant rents, prepared as always by Mr. Pratt, and on its surface it looked exactly as it always had. Neat rows of names and sums totaled at the bottom in Pratt's confident, practiced hand, but the total itself was lower than it should have been, lower than the same quarter the previous year, despite the fact that every tenant farm on the estate had reported a good harvest. Alaric was not a man who paid close attention to household figures. He had never needed to. That was, he had always believed, precisely what a steward was for, and Pratt had managed the estate's finances since before Alaric had come into his title, with a competence no one had ever thought to question. Yet the number in front of him now would not leave him alone. He sent for Pratt that same afternoon. "The rents are down again this quarter," Alaric said, without preamble, sliding the ledger across the desk. "Nearly £40 below last year by my count, despite a better harvest. Can you explain it?" Pratt's face, Alaric noted with mild surprise, did not fall into its usual easy confidence quite as quickly as it once had. There was the faintest hesitation before the steward answered, a beat too long to be entirely natural. "Repairs, Your Grace," Pratt said finally. "The eastern cottages required more work than expected this year, roofing mostly. I deducted the costs directly from the rents owed, to save the tenants the burden of paying twice." It was a reasonable enough explanation, delivered in the same confident tone Pratt always used, and a year ago, even a few months ago, Alaric would have accepted it without a second thought, and returned to whatever business had occupied him before. But something in the steward's brief hesitation, so slight most men would never have noticed it, stayed with him after Pratt had left the room. He found himself thinking, unwillingly, of Elara. It was not a thought he welcomed. He had spent 5 years training himself not to think of his wife as someone whose opinions mattered a great deal, and it unsettled him now to find her memory surfacing so readily, prompted by nothing more than a column of figures that did not add correctly. He remembered, with a discomfort he did not examine too closely, a conversation from perhaps 3 years past. Elara had come to him one evening, ledger in hand, her manner quiet but insistent in a way that was unusual for her, and had tried to explain some concern about the estate's finances. He had not truly listened. He remembered that much clearly, remembered waving her away with some remark about Pratt's long service and his own lack of interest in household arithmetic, and he remembered, too, the particular way she had gone still afterward, folding the conversation away as though she had expected exactly that response and was simply confirming it. He had not thought of that evening in years. He thought of it now, sitting alone in the estate office with a ledger that would not balance, and felt an unfamiliar and unwelcome prickle of doubt. He told himself it meant nothing. Pratt's explanation had been reasonable. Roofs did require repair. Numbers could shift from year to year for 100 ordinary reasons that had nothing to do with dishonesty. Still, that evening, instead of retiring after dinner as he usually did, Alaric found himself in the estate archive, a small dusty room adjoining the main office where old ledgers were stored once a year had closed. He was not entirely certain what he was looking for. He told himself he was simply confirming Pratt's account of the eastern cottage repairs, nothing more. It took him the better part of an hour, working by candlelight through dust and disorder, to find the ledgers from 2 years past. And it was there, buried among columns of figures he barely understood, that he first noticed something that made him go very still. In the margin of one page, in a small, careful hand that was unmistakably not Pratt's, someone had made a correction. A number crossed out, a new figure written beside it, and a tiny notation in the margin: rent paid in full per tenant, discrepancy in recorded sum. He turned several more pages and found more of the same. Small corrections, made quietly in a hand he did not immediately recognize, scattered through nearly a year's worth of household records. Someone, at some point, had gone through these books line by line, checking figures against some other source of information, and correcting what they found wrong. He sat back slowly in his chair, the candle guttering slightly in the draft from the door, and stared at the unfamiliar handwriting for a long moment before recognition finally settled over him, cold and unwelcome. He had seen that hand before. On letters. On household lists tucked occasionally into correspondence he had barely glanced at over the years. It was Alara's. He told himself at first that it meant little. Perhaps she had simply been keeping her own private notes out of some idle interest in numbers, the way some women took up needlework or watercolors as an occupation for otherwise empty hours. It was, he reasoned, hardly evidence of anything beyond a wife with too much time and too little to occupy it. But as he turned back through the pages, examining the corrections more closely, that explanation began to feel increasingly thin. The corrections were not idle. They were precise, methodical, cross-referenced in places against notations he did not fully understand, but which clearly indicated a deeper knowledge of the estate's finances than any wife managing simple household affairs would ordinarily possess. In several places, sums had been quietly adjusted downward from what Pratt had originally recorded, brought back in line with figures that, when Alaric checked them against separate tenant receipts also tucked into the same pages, appeared to be accurate. Someone had been correcting Pratt's books, correcting them for years apparently, without ever once bringing the matter to Alaric directly, beyond that single evening he remembered so poorly, the evening he had dismissed without truly hearing what she was trying to tell him. He sat in the dim archive for a long while after that, the old ledgers open before him, and allowed himself, for the first time in longer than he cared to admit, to genuinely consider the woman he had married. He had told the household, only weeks ago, that their marriage had given the house nothing. He had believed it entirely when he said it. Now, staring down at 5 years of quiet, careful corrections made in his wife's own hand, hidden in the margins of books no one else had ever thought to examine closely, he found that certainty cracking in a way he did not know how to name. He did not go to Pratt with what he had found. Not yet. Some instinct, still forming, told him to move carefully, to understand fully before he confronted a man who had served his family for over a decade, and who Alaric had trusted without question for nearly as long as he could remember. Instead, over the following days, he began, quietly and without announcement, to examine the estate's records himself. It was slow, unfamiliar work, and he found himself, more than once, wishing he had paid closer attention to such matters years earlier, wishing he possessed even a fraction of the careful patience that had clearly gone into the corrections scattered through his own household books. He rode out, on the third day, to the eastern cottages Pratt had cited as the reason for the reduced rents, and found the roofing repairs the steward had described. They were real enough. But when Alaric examined them closely, speaking directly with the tenants rather than relying on Pratt's account, he learned that the actual cost of the repairs had been considerably less than what appeared deducted from the rents in the estate books. It was old Mrs. Hargrove, in her small cottage at the edge of the eastern fields, who spoke to him most plainly, in the direct manner of a woman who had lived long enough to have little patience for careful phrasing. "The Duchess used to ask after such things herself, you know," Mrs. Hargrove said, as she poured him tea he had not expected to be offered. "Came out here more than once over the years, sat right where you're sitting now, and asked plain questions about what we paid and what work was actually done. Sharp woman, if you don't mind my saying so, Your Grace. Sharper than most gave her credit for." Alaric set down his cup carefully. "She came to you directly, about the rents?" "More than once. First time was years back, when I mentioned, offhand like, that our rent had crept up faster than any improvement to the cottage could explain. She didn't dismiss it the way some might, went and looked into it herself, far as I could tell, and things eased for a season or two after that. Then they'd creep up again, and she'd come round again, and things would ease again. Been that way for years, off and on. We always assumed she was the one keeping things fair, quiet as she was about it." Alaric rode back to the main house that evening, in a silence that had nothing to do with the empty road ahead of him, and everything to do with the growing, uncomfortable weight of what he was beginning to understand. He had dismissed his wife, publicly, as a woman who had given his house nothing. He had told an entire household, in words he could not now take back, that 5 years of marriage had produced no warmth, no purpose, nothing worth naming. And in that same span of years, apparently, she had been quietly, patiently protecting his tenants from a steward's dishonesty, correcting his own household books in secret, doing work that should have been his responsibility to notice and had instead fallen, unacknowledged, onto the shoulders of a wife he had never once thought to ask what she did with her days. He did not sleep well that night. He lay awake turning over memories he had not examined in years, small moments he had barely registered at the time, Alara's quiet insistence, that one evening he had dismissed so carelessly, the ink stains he had noticed occasionally on her fingers and never once asked about. The late hours she kept, which he had assumed, without ever confirming, were simply the habits of a woman with little else to occupy her. He had built an entire understanding of his wife on assumptions he had never once bothered to test, and he was beginning to suspect, with a discomfort that settled deeper the longer he sat with it, that nearly every one of those assumptions had been wrong. By the time dawn broke over the estate, Alaric had made a decision. He would not confront Pratt yet, not without more certainty than he currently possessed, but he intended, before he did anything else, to understand fully what his wife had done in this house over the past 5 years, whether she wished him to understand it or not. He did not yet know how he would go about it, but for the first time in longer than he could easily remember, he found himself wanting, quite urgently, to know the truth. While Alaric sat awake with his growing doubts, some miles distant, Alara was receiving a visitor of her own. Mr. Warwick Hale had known the Bennington family for over 20 years, first as a young clerk assisting Alaric's late father with matters of business, and later, once he had established his own practice, as the family's trusted solicitor for any legal affairs too delicate to entrust elsewhere. He was a careful man, precise in his habits, and it was precisely that precision that brought him, on a mild afternoon 3 weeks after Alara's removal to the Dower House, to pay a call he told himself was simply a matter of old courtesy. In truth, he had been troubled since hearing of the Duke's decision to set his wife aside. It was not his place to question a client's domestic arrangements, and he had said nothing to anyone of his private opinion on the matter. But he had always found Alara Whitmore, in the handful of occasions their paths had crossed over the years, to be a woman of unusual clarity and good sense, and the manner of her dismissal, delivered publicly and without apparent cause, had sat poorly with him ever since. Alara received him in the small sitting room, somewhat surprised by the visit but glad of the company. They spoke for a while of ordinary things, the weather, mutual acquaintances, the state of the roads, until Mr. Hale, in the course of conversation, happened to glance toward the writing desk beneath the window, and noticed a worn leather ledger resting there, its cover slightly open, a column of neat figures visible on the exposed page. "Forgive my curiosity," he said, "but is that an estate ledger, Your Grace? The hand looks remarkably like the old Bennington account books I used to review for His Grace's father." Alara felt her breath catch slightly, though she kept her expression carefully composed. She had grown so accustomed to keeping the ledger hidden that its casual exposure now, in a room she had not thought to guard as carefully as her old chamber, unsettled her more than she expected. "It is a private record," she said carefully. "Nothing of consequence." But Mr. Hale, whose entire profession depended on a sharp eye for figures, had already leaned forward slightly, his gaze moving over the exposed page with an interest he did not trouble to hide. "If I may, Your Grace, that column of tenant rents bears a striking resemblance to figures I reviewed years ago, when I still assisted with the estate's annual accounts. Might I ask what this ledger records?" Alara considered for a long moment whether to deflect the question entirely. She had kept the ledger secret for 5 years, telling no one, trusting no one with the full truth of what it contained. But something in Mr. Hale's careful, genuine curiosity, so different from Pratt's dismissive condescension or Alaric's careless indifference, made her hesitate. "It is a record I have kept privately," she said finally, "tracking discrepancies I noticed in the estate's official accounts, over a number of years." Mr. Hale's eyebrows rose slightly. "May I ask how significant these discrepancies are?" She hesitated only a moment longer before rising, crossing to the desk and lifting the ledger carefully in both hands. She had told herself, for 5 years, that this record was hers alone, built for no purpose beyond her own quiet understanding. But sitting now with a man whose entire career had been built on careful attention to exactly this kind of detail, she found herself, for the first time, genuinely wanting another set of eyes to confirm what she had long suspected alone. She handed him the ledger. Mr. Hale read in silence for a long while, turning pages slowly, his expression shifting gradually from polite interest to something closer to genuine astonishment. When he finally looked up, several minutes had passed. and the careful composure he usually maintained in professional matters had given way to something more openly startled. "Your Grace," he said slowly, "do you understand what you have compiled here?" "I believe I do. This is not a casual record of household discrepancies. This is a meticulously documented account of systematic financial mismanagement, cross-referenced against tenant receipts, tradesmen's invoices, and the estate's own official books, spanning nearly 5 years. I have reviewed accounts for a great many estates in my career, Your Grace, and I have rarely seen anything compiled with this degree of care." He paused, studying her with new appreciation. "This is, quite frankly, exactly the kind of evidence that would be required to prove deliberate embezzlement in a court of law, should it ever come to that." Elara felt something loosen slightly in her chest, some knot she had carried for so long she had almost forgotten it was there. "I did not compile it for a court of law, Mr. Hale. I compiled it because I could not, in good conscience, watch money quietly disappear from tenants who could ill afford the loss, while a steward everyone trusted continued unquestioned." "Then you must bring this forward," Hale said, his voice earnest. "Your Grace, forgive my bluntness, but this evidence deserves to be seen. It would prove, beyond any reasonable doubt, exactly who has been responsible for the estate's financial troubles these past years. It would prove, too, exactly how much you have done, quietly and without recognition, to protect that estate in spite of everything." Elara looked down at her own hands, folded in her lap, and thought of the great hall 3 weeks past, of Alaric's even voice telling the assembled household that their marriage had given him nothing. "I have no wish to beg for recognition from a man who dismissed me without troubling to ask what I had done," she said quietly. "If the truth comes forward, Mr. Hale, it will not be because I went crawling back to prove my worth to a husband who never thought to question his own certainty." Mr. Hale studied her for a long moment, something like quiet respect settling into his expression. "I understand your feeling, Your Grace, more than you might expect. But I would ask you to consider one thing. This is not only about what you are owed. There are tenant families on that estate who have been quietly wronged for years, and a steward who continues, even now, to take what does not belong to him. Whatever your feelings toward His Grace, the truth in this ledger deserves to matter for their sake, if not for your own." Elara said nothing for a long while, watching the last light fade over the overgrown garden beyond the window. She did not answer him that evening, and Mr. Hale, sensing she needed time rather than further persuasion, did not press her further before he took his leave. But long after he had gone, she sat alone with the ledger open before her, turning its familiar pages, and found his words settling into her thoughts in a way she could not easily dismiss. Mr. Hale returned to the Dower House 4 days later, though he had told himself, on the ride out, that he would not press the Duchess further if her answer remained the same. He found her in the garden this time, of all places, wearing gloves too large for her hands, pulling weeds from a bed of roses that had clearly been neglected for years. It struck him, watching her from the gravel path before she noticed him, as an oddly fitting image. A woman restoring order to something overgrown and forgotten, quietly, without asking anyone's permission to do so. "Mr. Hale," she rose, brushing dirt from her gloves, "I did not expect you again so soon. I confess I could not stay away, Your Grace. The matter has troubled my thoughts considerably since our last conversation." He hesitated, then continued more carefully. "I do not wish to press you toward a decision you are not ready to make, but I would ask, if you are willing, to allow me to make discreet inquiries on your behalf. Nothing public. Simply an assessment of whether the estate's current finances show signs consistent with what your ledger documents. If they do not, then perhaps the matter has already resolved itself, and there is no need to trouble you further." Elara considered this for a long moment, pulling off her gloves finger by finger. She had spent 4 days turning his previous visit over in her mind, torn between the fierce private pride that told her she owed her former household nothing further, and a quieter, more persistent voice that reminded her of Mrs. Hargrove's honest face, and the other tenant families who had trusted her over the years with small, worried confidences about rents that never seemed to add up quite right. "Discreet inquiries," she said finally. "Nothing brought before His Grace without my knowledge first. You have my word, Your Grace." She studied him a moment longer, then nodded once, sharply. "Very well." What neither of them knew, as they spoke quietly in the overgrown garden, was that some miles away, at the main house, Alaric had already begun inquiries of his own. He had spent the days since his discovery in the estate archive in a state of restless, uncharacteristic uncertainty. He was not accustomed to doubting his own judgment, and he found the sensation deeply uncomfortable, like wearing a coat cut for another man's shoulders. He had built his understanding of his marriage, and of his wife, on assumptions so old and so unexamined that he had never once thought to question them. Now those assumptions sat cracked open before him, and he did not entirely know how to proceed. He began, cautiously, by reviewing the estate's financial records more thoroughly than he had in years, comparing figures across several seasons, cross-referencing where he could against tenant correspondence kept in the estate archive. It was slow, unfamiliar work, made slower by his own lack of practice with such careful attention, but the pattern that emerged, however imperfectly he traced it, matched uncomfortably well with what he had glimpsed in the margins of the old ledgers. He found himself, more than once, wishing he could simply ask Ilara directly what she knew, rather than piecing together fragments of her hidden work through old books and second-hand accounts from tenants. But pride, and something closer to shame, kept him from riding to the dower house himself. He told himself he needed more certainty before he could face her. In truth, he was not entirely certain what he would say if he did. Instead, he sent quiet instructions to a clerk in the nearby town, a man with some experience reviewing estate accounts, asking him to examine the Bennington ledgers for the past several years and report any irregularities he could identify. He gave no explanation beyond a general concern for accuracy, and the clerk, accustomed to discretion, asked no questions beyond what was necessary. It was almost a week before the clerk's findings reached him, delivered in a plain sealed letter that Alaric read alone in his study late one evening. The fire burned down to embers around him. The findings were more damning than he had allowed himself to expect. Small, consistent discrepancies across nearly every category of estate income, always favoring the same direction, always small enough individually to escape casual notice, but substantial in total when tracked across several years. The clerk's careful language avoided direct accusation, but the implication was unmistakable. Someone had been quietly diverting estate funds for a considerable time, and the pattern, once identified, was difficult to explain by any innocent means. Alaric sat with the letter for a long time after he finished reading it, the fire dying slowly beside him, and felt something settle over him that was equal parts fury and shame. Fury at Pratt, for a betrayal that had apparently gone unnoticed for years under his own roof. And shame, deeper and more uncomfortable, at how easily that betrayal had continued precisely because he had trusted a steward's confident smile over his own wife's quiet insistence. He thought again of that evening, years past, when Ilara had come to him with her concerns, ledger in hand, and he had waved her away without truly listening. He wondered now how differently things might have gone had he simply taken a single evening to sit with her and examine what she had found, rather than dismissing her out of a comfortable, unexamined trust in a man he had never once thought to question. He did not confront Pratt that night, though every instinct urged him toward it. Instead, he sat alone in his study long after the fire had gone cold, turning over the growing certainty that he had misjudged, in nearly every particular, the woman he had married. The following morning, word reached him, through the ordinary channels of household gossip that traveled faster than any formal report, that a solicitor had been seen visiting the dower house on more than one occasion in recent days. Alaric received this news with a stillness that surprised even himself, a stillness that masked a sudden, sharp anxiety he did not examine too closely. He told himself it was simply prudent to know what his estranged wife was about, particularly given what he now suspected of Pratt's dealings. He told himself this had nothing to do with any deeper concern for her, and found, uncomfortably, that he did not entirely believe his own reasoning. He did not ride to the dower house that day, nor the day after. Pride held him back, and something else besides, a reluctance he was slow to name even to himself. He was not ready, he realized, to face Ilara directly, not until he understood fully what she had done, and what she might now think of a husband who had dismissed her so completely before finally, belatedly, beginning to see the truth. Instead, he threw himself further into his own quiet investigation, determined to understand the full scope of Pratt's dishonesty before he did anything further. He reviewed years of tenant correspondence, cross-checked repair invoices against work he could verify had actually been completed, and found, with each new discovery, his certainty deepening alongside his discomfort. It was during this careful review that he came across, tucked between the pages of an old estate diary, a folded note in Ilara's familiar hand, dated nearly 3 years past. It appeared to have been intended for him, though whether it had ever actually been delivered, or simply written and then abandoned, he could not tell. The note was brief and careful, describing in measured terms a concern about certain repair costs on the eastern cottages that did not seem to match the work actually completed. It ended with a single line that struck him harder than anything else he had read in days of careful investigation. I do not say this to trouble you, but because I believe the truth, however inconvenient, deserves to be known. He sat with that single sentence for a long while, the old diary open before him, and felt something in his chest tighten uncomfortably. She had tried, more than once apparently, to bring this matter to his attention, quietly and without accusation, and he had either dismissed her outright or, in this case, apparently never even read what she had written. He folded the note carefully and placed it in his coat pocket, a small, private weight he did not yet know what to do with, and resolved, before the day was finished, that he would ride to the Dower House himself, whatever uncertainty still held him back. He did not go that day after all. Some final hesitation he could not fully name, kept him at the main house a while longer, reviewing figures, gathering certainty, telling himself he needed just a little more evidence before he could face her. But the resolve had taken root, and it did not leave him. For the first time since he had stood before the household and dismissed his wife as a woman who had given him nothing, Alaric Bennington found himself preparing, carefully and deliberately, to seek her out. He was not the only person at Bennington House whose thoughts had grown unsettled in recent days. Mr. Pratt had noticed, with the particular sensitivity of a man long accustomed to watching for danger, that something in the household had shifted. The Duke had begun asking questions he had never troubled to ask before, small and seemingly idle, about repair costs and tenant rents, and the precise dates certain expenditures had been recorded. Alone, each question meant little. Together, they formed a pattern that made the back of Pratt's neck prickle with a wariness he had not felt in years. He told himself, at first, that it was nothing. The Duke had always been an incurious man where household finances were concerned, content to leave such matters entirely in Pratt's hands, and it seemed unlikely that such long habits of trust would break now, after so many years of undisturbed service. But the questions continued, and Pratt found himself, more than once, lying awake at night running through his own careful records, searching for any gap through which suspicion might slip. He had been careful, always. That had been the entire foundation of his success over the years, a discipline of restraint that had allowed him to take steadily, patiently, without ever taking so much that anyone troubled to look closely. He had learned, early in his scheme, that greed was the thing that undid most men in his position. Small sums, taken consistently and spread across many categories of expenditure, drew far less attention than any single dramatic theft. What he had not planned for, in all his careful calculations, was a duchess who noticed small things. He had dismissed her, that first year, with barely a second thought, certain that a young bride with no experience in estate matters would accept his easy explanations and trouble him no further. It had taken him longer than he cared to admit to realize his mistake, and by the time he understood how closely she had been watching, she had already built a private understanding of his methods thorough enough to worry him, had he known its full extent. He had comforted himself, over the years, with the knowledge that she never brought her concerns forward in any way that mattered. She spoke to her husband occasionally, he gathered from careful, indirect inquiries among the household staff, but the Duke had never once acted on whatever she said. Pratt had come to view her quiet vigilance as an irritation rather than a genuine threat, a woman scribbling in a private ledger no one else would ever trouble to read. Her sudden dismissal from the household, weeks past, had come as something of a relief to him, though he had been careful never to let that relief show. With her gone, he had assumed, reasonably enough, that whatever quiet watchfulness she had maintained over the years would simply fade into irrelevance, an old habit belonging to a woman no longer positioned to act on it. Now, watching the Duke's uncharacteristic new attention to figures he had never previously questioned, Pratt began to wonder, with mounting unease, whether he had been wrong to assume her influence would end so neatly with her departure. He considered, briefly, whether to approach the Duke directly, to offer some reassuring explanation before suspicion could deepen further. But every explanation he could construct felt thinner than the last, and he understood, with the particular clarity of a man who had spent years calculating risk, that offering unprompted explanations for questions not yet fully asked was more likely to arouse suspicion than settle it. Instead, he began, quietly, to consider what steps might be necessary to protect himself, should the Duke's growing curiosity ever harden into genuine accusation. He reviewed his own records carefully, searching for anything that might be altered or removed without drawing undue attention. He began, too, to think, for the first time in years, about where blame might most plausibly be directed, should the true state of the estate's finances ever come fully to light. It did not take him long to arrive at an answer he found, on careful reflection, rather elegant in its simplicity. The Duchess had, after all, kept records of her own for years, records no one else had ever seen, records she had apparently taken with her when she left. If suspicion ever did settle firmly on the estate's finances, what could be simpler and more believable than suggesting that a dismissed and resentful wife, humiliated before the entire household, had taken it upon herself to alter the books during her final months in residence, in some bitter act of revenge against a husband who had cast her aside? It was, he told himself, only a precaution. A story held in reserve, to be used only if genuinely necessary. He did not yet know how close the Duke's suspicions had truly come. Nor did he know, as he turned the idea over in his mind late that evening, that the very ledger he hoped to blame on his former mistress already sat in the hands of a solicitor beginning, at that very moment, to make careful and discreet inquiries on her behalf. The pieces of the truth were moving now, quietly, from several directions at once, each person involved unaware of how close the others had already come. Alaric, gathering evidence and courage in equal measure at the main house. Alara, weighing 4 days of careful thought against a pride that had protected her for years. Mr. Hale, beginning his discreet review of the estate's current accounts. And Pratt, sharpening a story he hoped he would never need to use, unaware that the woman he intended to blame had already placed the truth into hands far more capable than his own of bringing it fully into the light. Mr. Hale's discreet inquiries did not remain discreet for long. He had been careful, in the days following his second visit to the Dower House, to make his questions appear as ordinary as possible, framing his review of certain estate expenditures as a routine matter of legal housekeeping, rather than any pointed investigation. But Pratt, already sharpened to suspicion by the Duke's own unusual attention, noticed the solicitor's inquiries almost immediately, and understood, with a cold certainty that settled deep in his chest, that the 2 threads of danger he had been watching separately were, in fact, one and the same. He did not panic. Panic, he had always believed, was what undid careless men, and he had built his entire scheme on the discipline of never allowing panic to guide his actions. But he understood now, with unwelcome clarity, that his time had grown considerably shorter than he had hoped. That evening, working late by candlelight in the estate office, Pratt began methodically altering what records he could, adjusting old entries where the ink had not yet fully aged, removing certain pages entirely where alteration seemed too risky, and preparing, carefully, the story he had already begun rehearsing in his mind. A dismissed wife, bitter over her removal, who had taken advantage of her final months in the household to tamper with the estate's books, hoping to cast suspicion on a steward who had served the family faithfully for over a decade. It was, he told himself, a story with enough plausibility to hold, particularly given how publicly and humiliatingly the Duchess had been cast aside. Who would believe her word over his, especially once he had woven enough small, damning details into his account to make her supposed resentment feel entirely understandable? He did not know, as he worked late into the night reshaping the truth to suit his own survival, that the original evidence he hoped to discredit no longer sat in some hidden compartment at the Dower House, vulnerable to whatever story he might construct against it. It sat, instead, in the careful, professional custody of a solicitor who had already begun, quietly and methodically, building a case of his own. Mr. Hale's review of the estate's current finances, completed over several careful days, confirmed everything Alara's private ledger had documented, and more besides. The pattern of small, consistent discrepancies had continued unabated in the weeks since her departure, exactly as she had predicted it would, further proof, if any were still needed, that the mismanagement she had tracked for years had never originated with her at all. He brought his findings to Alara on a gray morning, some 10 days after his first visit, his expression carrying a gravity that told her, before he spoke a single word, that matters had moved beyond anything either of them had initially anticipated. "Your Grace," he said, once seated in her small sitting room, "I must tell you that the situation has grown considerably more urgent than I first believed. I have reason to think Mr. Pratt has become aware that his conduct is under scrutiny, and men in his position, once cornered, do not always respond wisely." Alara felt a chill settle over her that had nothing to do with the cool morning air. "What do you mean?" "I have received word, through a contact still employed at the main house, that Pratt has been working unusually late in the estate office these past several evenings, and that certain older records appear to have gone missing from the archive. I cannot yet prove what he intends, but I would not be surprised, Your Grace, if he is preparing some account that shifts blame away from himself, possibly toward you." The words landed with a force Alara had not expected. She had anticipated, in some distant way, that the truth might eventually surface, but she had not fully considered the possibility that Pratt, faced with exposure, might attempt to turn the truth into a weapon against her instead. He would accuse me, she said slowly, of the very thing he has spent years doing himself. It is precisely the kind of story that could hold your grace, particularly given the circumstances of your removal from the household, a dismissed wife, humiliated before the household, with apparent motive for resentment. It is not difficult to imagine such a narrative gaining sympathy, especially if presented before anyone has seen the true evidence you hold. Alara sat very still for a long moment, feeling old instincts, old caution, rising in her once more. For 5 years she had protected herself by staying quiet, by letting her work speak in corrections no one noticed rather than accusations no one would believe. That instinct urged her now toward continued silence, toward simply enduring whatever story Pratt constructed, rather than stepping forward to contest it. But another instinct, quieter and more insistent, reminded her of Mrs. Hargrove's honest face, and the other tenant families who had trusted her, and the simple, undeniable truth that remained hers regardless of whatever story anyone else attempted to tell. "I will not sit quietly while a thief accuses me of his own crimes," she said finally, her voice steady in a way that surprised even herself. "What must I do, Mr. Hale?" Relief passed visibly across the solicitor's face. "I believe, Your Grace, the wisest course is to bring the ledger forward ourselves, before Pratt has the opportunity to present his own account first. I would recommend we approach His Grace directly, with the evidence laid out clearly and completely, before any accusation against you has the chance to take root." Alara considered this, weighing the prospect of facing Alaric directly against everything that had passed between them these last weeks. She had told herself, that first night at the Dower House, that she would not beg for recognition from a man who had dismissed her without asking a single question about what she had done. But this, she reminded herself, was no longer only about recognition. It was about the truth, and about protecting herself from an accusation that would otherwise stand unanswered.
"Very well," she said. "Arrange it."
What neither of them yet knew was that Alaric, at that very moment, some miles distant, had finally overcome his own hesitation and was already riding toward the Dower House himself, the folded note from his wife's hand still carried carefully in his coat pocket. He arrived just past midday, unannounced, and found Mrs. Fenwick startled, nearly speechless by the sight of the Duke himself standing at the Dower House door. She showed him into the small sitting room, where Alara sat with Mr. Hale, the ledger open on the table between them, both of them clearly in the midst of some serious conversation that stopped abruptly the moment Alaric entered. For a long moment no one spoke. Alaric's gaze moved from his wife's composed, guarded expression to the solicitor beside her, and finally to the worn leather ledger resting open on the table, its pages covered in a hand he now recognized instantly. "I did not expect visitors of my own to be already occupied," he said finally, his voice carrying an uncertainty unfamiliar to anyone who knew him. "Your Grace." Mr. Hale rose, offering a formal bow, though his eyes moved briefly, questioningly, toward Alara. "We were, in fact, preparing to seek you out ourselves, on a matter of some urgency." Alaric's gaze had not left the ledger. "Is that what I believe it to be?" Alara held his gaze steadily, 5 years of careful composure settling over her once more, though beneath it something far less certain trembled. "It is a record I have kept privately, for 5 years, of discrepancies in the estate's finances. Discrepancies I believe Mr. Pratt has been responsible for creating, and which I have quietly corrected wherever I was able, without your knowledge, because you made it clear, more than once, that my concerns on such matters did not merit your attention." The words landed with a quiet precision that struck harder than any raised voice might have. Alaric said nothing for a long moment, his gaze moving between his wife's steady composure and the ledger that had already, quietly, confirmed everything he had spent the past 2 weeks discovering on his own. "May I see it?" he asked finally. Alara hesitated only briefly before nodding to Mr. Hale, who lifted the ledger and offered it across the table. Alaric took it carefully, as though it might be fragile, and began turning its pages, slowly at first, then with growing intensity, as 5 years of careful documentation unfolded before him, in his wife's own precise hand. He recognized, with each page, details that matched exactly what his own recent investigation had uncovered. The Eastern cottage repairs, the tenant rents that never quite matched what the tenants themselves reported paying. Small discrepancies, tracked and cross-referenced across years, each one corrected quietly, without acknowledgement, by a woman he had dismissed as having given his house nothing. "You corrected these," he said finally, looking up from the pages, "for years, without telling me." "I told you," Alara said, and there was no anger in her voice now, only a tired, weary honesty. "More than once. You did not wish to hear it. Alaric closed his eyes briefly, the weight of that simple truth settling over him more heavily than any accusation could have. I know, he said quietly. I have come to understand that, these past weeks, more thoroughly than I wish I had. Mr. Hale, watching the exchange with careful professional discretion, chose this moment to speak. Your Grace, I regret to inform you that the matter has grown considerably more urgent. We have reason to believe Mr. Pratt, aware his conduct may be under scrutiny, is preparing to shift blame for the estate's financial troubles onto your wife directly. Alaric's expression hardened, the uncertainty of moments before giving way to something colder and more decisive. Then we will not give him the opportunity. He set the ledger down carefully on the table, and for the first time since entering the room, looked directly at Alara with an expression that held none of the cold distance she had grown accustomed to over 5 years of marriage. I have been a fool, he said quietly. I built 5 years of certainty on assumptions I never once troubled to examine, and I dismissed the one person in this house who was quietly holding it together, because it was easier to trust a man's confident smile than to sit with my own wife and truly listen to what she was trying to tell me. Alara said nothing for a long moment, old caution warring with something else, something she had not allowed herself to feel in longer than she could easily remember. You are here now, she said finally. That will have to be sufficient for the moment. There is a more immediate matter to address. Alaric nodded, some of the old resolve returning to his bearing, though tempered now by something considerably humbler than it had been. Pratt, he said, whatever story he intends to tell, he will tell it to my face, with this ledger and Mr. Hale's own findings laid before him. I will not let him make you the villain of a crime you spent 5 years quietly preventing. Mr. Hale rose, gathering the ledger carefully. I would recommend we act quickly, Your Grace. Every day we delay gives him further opportunity to alter records or construct a more convincing account. Tomorrow then, Alaric said, at the main house. I want this settled before the household, plainly and completely, so there can be no question afterward of what truly happened these past 5 years. Alara rose as well, feeling something steady settling over her that she had not felt in longer than she could remember. A sense that the long, quiet years of careful, unacknowledged work were finally, at last, about to be seen. Tomorrow, she agreed. Neither of them spoke further of what had passed between them, of 5 years of coldness and dismissal now cracked open by a single afternoon's revelation. That reckoning, they both understood without saying so aloud, would have to wait until the more immediate reckoning had been settled first. But something had shifted in the small sitting room of the Dower House that afternoon, quiet and uncertain as it was, and neither of them, riding back toward the main house in the fading light, could quite pretend it had not. That evening, unaware of how swiftly the ground beneath him had shifted, Pratt continued his careful work in the estate office, finishing the last of the alterations he judged safe to make, and rehearsing, once more, the story he intended to offer should the Duke's questions ever harden into direct accusation. He felt, if not entirely at ease, at least reasonably confident that he had built enough uncertainty into the record to protect himself should matters come to a reckoning. He did not know that the true ledger, the one document capable of unraveling every careful alteration he had made, already sat beyond his reach, safely in the hands of a solicitor who had spent the day compiling a case built on evidence far more thorough than anything Pratt could hope to counter. He did not know that the Duke himself had already seen it, had already turned its pages with his own hands and recognized, beyond any further doubt, the truth of what his wife had quietly done. And he certainly did not know that a summons would arrive at first light the following morning, requesting his presence in the main hall at midday, for a matter the note described only as urgent estate business requiring his immediate attention. He read the summons twice over his breakfast, a faint unease prickling at the back of his neck that he could not quite name, and told himself, as he had told himself every day for the past 2 weeks, that his preparations were sufficient, that whatever suspicion had begun to gather could still be managed, redirected, survived. He was, for the first time in over a decade of careful, patient theft, entirely mistaken. At the Dower House, Alara spent a restless night turning over everything the afternoon had revealed. She had expected, when Mr. Hale first suggested bringing the ledger forward, that any eventual confrontation with Alaric would be cold and formal, a simple presentation of evidence with little room for anything more personal to pass between them. She had not expected the raw, unguarded honesty in his voice when he admitted, plainly and without excuse, that he had been a fool. She did not yet know what to make of that honesty. 5 years of careful self-protection had taught her not to trust easily in sudden changes of heart, particularly not from a man who had built an entire marriage on comfortable, unexamined certainty. And yet something in his expression that afternoon, the genuine weight of regret behind his words, had struck her as different from anything she had witnessed from him before. She rose before dawn, dressed carefully, and packed the few belongings she thought she might need for what promised to be a difficult day, uncertain whether she would return to the Dower house that evening, or whether the reckoning ahead might change, in ways she could not yet predict, where she belonged when the day was finished. Mrs. Fenwick, sensing the gravity of the morning without being told its particulars, pressed a small basket of bread and cheese into her hands as she prepared to depart, along with a quiet, heartfelt wish for good fortune that Alara found unexpectedly moving. "Whatever happens today, Your Grace," the housekeeper said, "there are those of us who have long suspected there was more to you than this house was ever given the chance to see." Alara thanked her, genuinely touched, and climbed into the carriage Alaric had sent for her that morning, the ledger safely in Mr. Hale's careful custody, riding separately to ensure it arrived at the main house secure and untampered with. The journey passed largely in silence, Alara watching the familiar landscape unfold beyond the window, fields and hedgerows she had ridden past countless times over 5 years of quiet, unacknowledged work. She thought of Mrs. Hargrove and the other tenant families who had trusted her with small, worried confidences over the years. She thought of the late nights at the estate desk, correcting figures no one had asked her to correct, building a private record that had once felt like her only true possession in a house that valued her for nothing else. Today, at last, that record would be seen. Whatever else the day brought, whatever remained uncertain about her marriage and the man she had left behind in that great hall 3 weeks past, the truth itself would finally stand plainly before everyone who had ever doubted her. The carriage rolled through the familiar gates of Bennington House as the morning sun climbed higher, and Alara straightened her spine, folded her hands calmly in her lap, and prepared to face, for the final time, a household that had once called her dull and unremarkable. She intended, whatever happened next, to leave that particular judgment thoroughly and permanently behind her. The great hall at Bennington House was fuller than it had been in years when Alara arrived, its assembled household summoned by a note from the Duke that morning promising only that a matter of grave importance concerning the estate's affairs would be settled before midday. She recognized many of the faces gathered there, the housekeeper who had gone pale weeks ago at the sound of her dismissal, the young footman who had dropped his tray, Marjorie, standing near the back, catching Alara's eye with a small, hopeful smile that steadied her more than she expected. And near the fire, in the same chair she had occupied that first terrible evening, sat the Dowager Duchess, her embroidery frame once again untouched in her lap, her expression carrying the faint, brittle confidence of a woman who did not yet understand how thoroughly the ground beneath her had shifted. Mr. Pratt stood near the center of the hall, summoned as instructed, his posture carrying its usual practiced confidence, though Alara, watching closely, noted the faint tension at the corners of his mouth that suggested he understood, at least in part, that something unusual was unfolding. Alaric entered last, the worn leather ledger carried carefully in his own hands, Mr. Hale following a step behind him with a folder of additional documents. The room fell silent as the Duke crossed to stand before the assembled household, his gaze moving briefly, deliberately, to where Alara stood near the entrance, before returning to the room at large. "I have called you all here," Alaric said, his voice carrying the same even authority it always had, though something in his bearing today felt different, less certain of its own righteousness than it had 3 weeks past. "Because a matter has come to light that concerns every person in this household, and because I owe a public correction to words I spoke in this very hall not long ago." A murmur passed through the assembled servants, the dowager's needle stilled in her lap. "3 weeks ago," Alaric continued, "I stood in this hall and told my wife that our marriage had given this house nothing. I believed it entirely when I said it. I have since learned that I was wrong, in nearly every particular, and I intend this morning to make that error plain before all of you, as publicly as I made it in the first place." He turned, opening the ledger, and held it up so that those nearest could see the careful, precise hand filling its pages. "For 5 years, my wife has kept a private record, documenting discrepancies in this estate's finances. Discrepancies that, upon careful investigation these past 2 weeks, I have confirmed correspond precisely to a pattern of sustained financial mismanagement carried out by Mr. Pratt." Pratt's composure cracked visibly for the first time, a flicker of alarm passing across his face before he mastered it again. "Your Grace, I must protest such an accusation. Household books rarely balance perfectly, and if the Duchess kept some private record of imagined discrepancies during her time here, I hardly think—" "I would not interrupt further, Mr. Pratt," were I in your position, Mr. Hale said, stepping forward with quiet authority. I have spent the past several days conducting an independent review of the estate's current finances, entirely separate from the Duchess's own record, and I can confirm that the pattern she documented has continued, unabated, in the weeks since her departure. Rents recorded below what tenants themselves report paying, repair costs inflated beyond the actual expense of work completed, a pattern spanning years, consistent enough to leave little room for innocent explanation. Furthermore, Alaric added, his voice hardening, I have learned, through inquiries of my own, that certain older estate records have gone missing from the archive in recent days, and that you have been observed working unusually late hours these past 2 weeks. I would ask you now, plainly, to explain these facts, Mr. Pratt, if you are able. The hall had gone utterly silent, every servant present watching the steward with an attention he had likely never received in over a decade of quiet, trusted service. Pratt's gaze moved briefly, desperately, toward the Dowager, as though seeking some ally who might yet come to his defense. The Dowager said nothing. Her expression, Elara noted, had shifted from brittle confidence to something closer to genuine alarm, as the full weight of what was unfolding began, belatedly, to settle over her as well. I have served this family faithfully for over 10 years, Pratt said finally, his voice carrying a defensive edge that had lost most of its earlier confidence. Whatever discrepancies exist in the estate's books can surely be explained by ordinary error, or perhaps by interference from someone with less experience in such matters than myself. Are you suggesting, Alaric said, his voice dangerously quiet now, that my wife altered these records herself, out of some resentment following her removal from this household? Pratt hesitated. The story he had so carefully prepared, clearly faltering now under the weight of evidence he had not anticipated arriving so thoroughly documented, or so swiftly presented. I would not presume to make such a direct accusation, Your Grace, only to suggest that— You would have suggested precisely that, Mr. Hale interrupted, had circumstances allowed you the opportunity. I have here a statement from a clerk in town who confirms the pattern of discrepancies extends back considerably further than the Duchess's departure, in fact, back to nearly the beginning of her marriage, long before she had any reason for resentment of any kind. I have tenant testimonies confirming rents paid that do not match your official records, and I have the Duchess's own ledger, cross-referenced meticulously against these same sources, compiled over 5 years with a thoroughness that leaves very little room for doubt about who has truly been responsible for this estate's financial troubles. The silence that followed stretched long enough that even the fire seemed to burn more quietly. Pratt's shoulders sagged, the last of his practiced confidence finally draining away entirely, and in the space of that silence, the truth of 5 years settled plainly, undeniably, over the entire assembled household. Your Grace, Pratt said finally, his voice much smaller now than it had been moments before, I would ask for some private consideration of the circumstances, before matters proceed further in front of the household. You will have the opportunity to explain yourself fully and to make what restitution you are able, Alaric said, but you will not have the opportunity to do so quietly, nor will you continue in this household's employment one moment longer. Mr. Hale will accompany you to gather what records remain, and the matter will proceed through whatever legal channels are appropriate given the scope of what has been taken. 2 footmen, at a quiet gesture from Alaric, moved to accompany Pratt and Mr. Hale from the hall, the steward's earlier confidence entirely gone now, replaced by the diminished bearing of a man whose careful scheme had finally, after over a decade, come fully into the light. Once they had gone, Alaric turned to face the remaining household, and to the Dowager, whose needlework had slipped entirely from her lap, unnoticed, onto the floor. There is a further matter I wish to address plainly, Alaric said, his gaze moving now to his mother. Discrepancies of this nature do not go unnoticed by everyone, particularly across 5 years, without someone in a position of authority choosing not to look too closely, or choosing to encourage doubt about the one person who did look closely. I do not yet know the full extent of what you knew, Mother, but I intend to learn it, and I expect, going forward, considerably more honesty in this household than it has recently practiced. The Dowager's face had gone pale. Though she said nothing, her earlier composure entirely abandoned in the face of a reckoning she had clearly not anticipated arriving in quite this form. Alaric turned then, finally, to Elara, who had stood throughout the entire exchange near the back of the hall, watching 5 years of careful hidden work finally receive the acknowledgement it had always deserved, and never once received. He crossed the room to stand before her, and for a long moment, in front of the entire assembled household, he simply looked at her, as though seeing her clearly for the first time in longer than either of them cared to count. I told this household, in this very place, that you had given me nothing, he said, his voice carrying now none of the cold certainty it had held that first terrible evening. I was wrong. You gave this house 5 years of quiet protection it never knew to thank you for, and you gave me a truth I was too proud and too foolish to listen to when it might have mattered most. I do not know if there is any way to properly correct such an error, spoken so publicly and believed so completely. But I intend to try, if you will allow me the chance. The hall remained utterly silent, every servant present watching the exchange with an attention that made Alara acutely aware of how thoroughly her circumstances had shifted since that first evening 3 weeks past. She thought of Mrs. Hargrove's honest face, of Marjorie's quiet kindness on that last terrible night, of 5 years spent believing herself unremarkable and unwatched, only to discover, at last, that the truth had simply been waiting for someone willing to look at it properly. You dismissed me before this entire household without asking a single question, she said finally, her voice steady and clear enough to carry through the silent hall. I will not pretend that wound closes, simply because the truth has now been made plain. But I will say this. I did not do what I did these past 5 years for your recognition, or for anyone's recognition. I did it because it was right, and because I could not, in good conscience, do otherwise. Whatever comes next between us, that much will not change. I would not ask you to pretend otherwise, Alaric said quietly. I would only ask for the chance to earn, honestly and slowly, whatever trust remains possible to rebuild, not because you owe it to me, because I finally understand what I have spent 5 years failing to see. Alara studied him for a long moment, 5 years of careful composure and quiet endurance settling into something that felt, for the first time in longer than she could remember, less like defense and more like genuine consideration. She did not answer him immediately, and he did not press her further, understanding, perhaps for the first time in their marriage, that some things could not be resolved by simple declaration alone, however honestly meant. I will consider it, she said finally. But I will not return to the Dower House tonight as a wife merely reinstated by correction, as though nothing more were required than an admission of error. If I return to this house, it will be as myself, fully, with my own place in its affairs plainly acknowledged, not quietly hidden in the margins of ledgers no one troubles to read. Agreed, Alaric said without hesitation. Entirely and completely agreed. Around them, the household began, slowly, to disperse to their duties, though the quiet murmur of conversation that followed carried, for the first time in years, something closer to genuine warmth toward the woman they had so recently watched, dismissed without a single word of complaint on her own behalf. Alara remained a while longer in the great hall after most had gone, standing near the tall windows where the morning light now fell clean and bright across the floor, and allowed herself, finally, a long, unguarded breath. The truth had been seen. Whatever came next, however long it took to rebuild what 5 years of quiet dismissal had worn away, that much, at least, could no longer be taken from her. News of the morning's events traveled quickly beyond the walls of Bennington House, as such news always does in a household of many servants and few genuine secrets. By early afternoon, word had reached the tenant farms scattered across the estate, carried by grooms and delivery boys eager to share such dramatic developments, and it was not long before a small procession of tenant families began arriving at the main house, ostensibly on ordinary business, though their true purpose was plain enough to anyone who cared to notice. Mrs. Hargrove arrived among the first, her weathered face carrying an expression of fierce satisfaction, as she was shown into the parlor where Alara sat, still gathering her composure after the morning's exchange. I heard the truth of it finally came out, Mrs. Hargrove said, settling herself into a chair without waiting for invitation, in the manner of a woman who had long since earned the right to speak plainly. About time, if you don't mind my saying so, Your Grace. Some of us have known for years there was more sense in your quiet questions than in that steward's confident smiles. You are kind to say so, Mrs. Hargrove. Kindness has nothing to do with it. It's simple truth. You came out to our cottage more times than I can easily count, asking plain questions no one else troubled to ask, and setting things right when you found them wrong, quiet as you were about it. We always wondered why a duchess would trouble herself so with tenant business. Now I suppose we understand a great deal better. Other tenants followed throughout the afternoon, each bringing some small confirmation of what Alara's ledger had already documented so thoroughly, each offering, in their own plain way, an acknowledgement that had been 5 years in coming. Alara found herself, by the time the last visitor departed as evening approached, unexpectedly moved by the quiet, genuine warmth of people she had known only through careful, discreet visits over the years, people who had apparently understood, far better than her own husband, exactly what she had been doing all along. Alaric found her alone in the parlor once the last tenant had gone, the late afternoon light slanting gold across the room, and stood a moment in the doorway before speaking, as though uncertain of his welcome even now. "The tenants think a great deal more of you than I ever troubled to discover," he said finally. "They had the advantage of actually listening when I spoke." He accepted this without argument, crossing the room slowly to stand near the window, his gaze moving out over the estate grounds he had governed. He was beginning to understand, with considerably less attention than the task deserved. "I have spoken with my mother," he said after a moment. "She claims she knew nothing of Pratt's specific dealings, though I suspect she knew rather more than she wishes to admit about how thoroughly she discouraged me from listening to you these past 5 years. I have told her, in plain terms, that such interference will not continue, whatever shape our household takes going forward." Elara said nothing for a moment, turning this over carefully. 5 years of the dowager's quiet cruelty did not dissolve simply because her son had finally recognized its effects, and she suspected the older woman's cooperation, whatever form it took, would be offered with considerably more resentment than genuine remorse. But it was, she acknowledged privately, more than she had ever expected to receive. "And Pratt?" she asked. "Mr. Hale is arranging the legal particulars this evening. Given the scope of what he has taken over the years, I expect the matter will proceed to formal prosecution, though Hale believes restitution of some portion of the funds may still be possible, depending on what remains of Pratt's own resources." Alaric paused, then added, more quietly, "I owe you an apology considerably more thorough than what I offered this morning, Elara, not simply for dismissing your concerns about Pratt, but for 5 years of assuming, without ever once genuinely testing the assumption, that you had little of substance to offer this marriage, beyond quiet compliance." Elara studied him for a long moment, weighing the sincerity in his voice against 5 years of accumulated caution that did not simply dissolve because circumstances had finally forced a reckoning. "I appreciate the apology," she said finally. "But apologies, however sincerely offered, do not undo 5 years in a single afternoon. I meant what I said in the hall this morning. If I return to this house, it will not be as the same quiet, overlooked wife I was before I left it." "I would not want you to be," Alaric said, and something in his voice, some genuine, uncertain honesty, made her believe him more than she had expected to. "I have spent 2 weeks learning, in considerable discomfort, exactly how much I failed to see in 5 years of marriage. I do not intend to make the same error twice, whatever it costs my pride to admit it." They stood together in the fading light for a while longer, neither quite ready to say more than had already been said, the estate settling into evening quiet around them, 5 years of careful distance beginning, slowly and uncertainly, to close. Elara did not return to the dower house that night, though she took her old chamber back with careful deliberation rather than any easy assumption that everything had simply resumed as before. Marjorie, arriving to help her settle back in, could not entirely contain her evident pleasure at the change, chattering happily about how the whole household had spoken of little else all afternoon. "They are already saying, below stairs, that you are the reason this estate did not fall into ruin these past years," Marjorie said, folding linens with brisk efficiency. "The kind of thing folks say quietly among themselves. Mind, not the sort of talk that reaches the family dining room easily. But it is being said, all the same, and I think it will keep being said, long after today." Elara allowed herself a small, tired smile at that, sitting by the window of the chamber she had once believed she would never see again. "Let them say it," she said. "I find, after everything, that I no longer mind being seen." Outside, the last light faded slowly over the estate grounds, over cottages and fields and a household finally beginning to understand exactly what it had so carelessly overlooked for 5 long years, and Elara sat a while longer in the quiet, watching the darkness settle, before she finally rose and prepared, for the first time in longer than she could easily remember, to sleep without the old, familiar weight of being unseen pressing down upon her chest. 6 months after the truth came out in the great hall at Bennington House, Elara sat at the desk in the estate office, a desk that had once belonged entirely to Mr. Pratt, now hers by open and formal arrangement rather than quiet, hidden necessity. The office looked different than it had during her years of secret correction. The ledgers were arranged openly across the desk rather than hidden beneath false compartments and borrowed shawls. A second chair had been added beside her own, where Alaric now sat most mornings, reviewing figures alongside her with an attentiveness that would have seemed impossible to imagine, had anyone described it to her, on that first terrible evening in the great hall. "The Eastern Cottage repairs came in under budget this quarter," Alaric said, studying the column of figures she had shown him earlier that morning. First time in longer than I care to admit. The new steward has considerably more integrity than the last, Alara said, allowing herself a small, dry smile. It helps. They had hired a replacement for Pratt within a month of his dismissal. A careful young man named Peter Aldridge who had come recommended by Mr. Hale, and who had proven, in the months since, entirely without the old steward's talent for quiet, patient theft. More significantly, Alara now reviewed the estate's finances openly alongside him, her years of careful private study finally acknowledged as the genuine expertise it had always been, rather than an idle habit to be dismissed with a patronizing smile. Pratt's own reckoning had proceeded, over the intervening months, through the legal channels Mr. Hale had set in motion that first difficult day. The full scope of his theft, once properly documented and pursued, had proven even more extensive than Alara's careful ledger alone had captured, stretching back nearly the entire length of his employment with the family. He had been made to surrender what remained of his ill-gotten resources toward restitution, and the matter had concluded, some months past, with a formal judgment that left little room for anyone in the county to doubt exactly who had been responsible for years of quiet estate mismanagement. The Dowager Duchess had grown considerably quieter in the months since that reckoning, her once confident authority over the household diminished by a truth she had, at minimum, chosen not to look at too closely for years. She remained at Bennington House still, her position as Alaric's mother not something easily set aside, but her interference in matters between her son and his wife had ceased almost entirely, replaced by a wary, careful distance that Alara found, if not warm, at least considerably more bearable than the years of open contempt that had preceded it. The marriage itself had not transformed overnight into the easy warmth of a storybook reconciliation, and Alara had been careful, in the months since that first difficult conversation in the parlor, not to pretend otherwise, either to herself or to Alaric. 5 years of careful distance did not simply dissolve because a single dramatic morning had finally forced a reckoning. Trust, she had told him plainly, more than once, would need to be rebuilt slowly, through consistent action rather than declared intention, and Alaric, to his credit, had not argued the point. He had, instead, spent the months since demonstrating exactly the kind of consistent attention she had once, quietly and without hope, wished for during the early years of their marriage. He asked after her opinions now, genuinely, and waited to hear her full answer rather than moving quickly past it toward his own conclusions. He accompanied her, more than once, on visits to tenant families, listening directly to concerns he had once left entirely to a steward's careless management. He had begun, slowly, to understand the particular satisfaction she found in careful, precise work, and had even, on several occasions, sought her guidance on estate matters that extended well beyond the financial concerns that had first revealed her quiet competence. It was not, Alara reflected, watching him study the morning's figures with genuine focus rather than polite indifference, the marriage she had once hoped for as a nervous bride of 19. It was something different, built more slowly and more deliberately, out of honest reckoning rather than easy assumption. She found, to her own quiet surprise, that she valued it considerably more for having been earned rather than simply granted. Marjorie, promoted in recent months to Alara's personal lady's maid, a position she filled with evident pride and considerable competence, knocked lightly at the office door that morning to announce a visitor. "Mrs. Hargrove has come to call, Your Grace," Marjorie said, "though she insists it is nothing important and you needn't trouble yourself if you're occupied." "Show her in," Alara said, setting aside the ledger with genuine pleasure. Mrs. Hargrove had become a regular visitor to the main house in recent months, their old, careful discretion no longer necessary now that Alara's involvement in estate affairs was openly acknowledged, and their conversations had grown, over time, into something closer to genuine friendship than the cautious tenant relationship they had once maintained. Mrs. Hargrove entered with her usual brisk energy, settling into the chair Alaric vacated with a polite nod, and launched immediately into an account of the season's harvest. Considerably improved, she noted with evident satisfaction, now that tenant rents were recorded honestly, and repair costs reflected the actual work completed, rather than whatever inflated sum a dishonest steward had judged the estate could bear. "The whole Eastern District speaks well of the changes," Mrs. Hargrove said, accepting the tea Marjorie brought without being asked. "Folk notice, you know, when things are handled fairly. Takes them a while to trust it fully, mind, after years of the old way, but they notice." Alara found herself, listening to this simple, genuine praise, thinking back to that first terrible evening in the Great Hall, to the Dowager's quiet satisfaction, and Alaric's cold, certain dismissal, to a woman who had believed herself entirely unremarkable, valued for nothing beyond quiet compliance, in a house that had never troubled to look closely enough to see otherwise. That woman felt, sitting now in an office that was genuinely hers, distant enough to seem almost like a different person entirely. Later that evening, after Mrs. Hargrove had departed and the estate office had gone quiet, Elara walked out into the garden that had, in recent months, been restored to something considerably closer to its former beauty. The roses she had once tended alone at the overgrown dower house now transplanted, at her own careful direction, into the main house grounds as well. Alaric found her there as the light began to fade, and stood beside her a while in comfortable silence before speaking. "I have been thinking," he said, "that we ought to hold some manner of gathering, before the season turns. Nothing excessive. Simply an acknowledgement, before our neighbors and the wider county, of the changes this estate has undergone this past year, and of the person most responsible for setting it right." Elara considered this, watching the last light settle gold across the restored garden. "I have no need of public celebration, Alaric. The truth stood plainly enough in that hall 6 months ago. I do not require further ceremony to feel it settled." "Perhaps not," Alaric agreed. "But I find, having spent 5 years failing to acknowledge you properly, that I have rather a great deal of catching up still to do. Allow me this much at least." She studied him a long moment. 5 years of careful caution softened now, gradually, by months of consistent, honest effort, and found herself, at last, genuinely smiling. "Very well," she said, "but nothing excessive." "Nothing excessive," he agreed, and reached, tentatively, for her hand, an old habit neither of them had practiced in longer than either cared to count. She allowed it, feeling the warmth of his fingers close carefully around her own, and thought, standing together in the fading evening light of a garden neither of them had ever properly tended together before this year, that perhaps some things, however slowly and however imperfectly, could still be rebuilt from what had once seemed entirely lost. The gathering Alaric proposed took place some weeks later, on a clear autumn afternoon, with neighboring families and county acquaintances invited to Bennington House for what was described, in the careful language of the invitation, as a celebration of the estate's renewed prosperity. Elara had insisted on modest simplicity rather than elaborate display, and Alaric, true to his word, had honored that wish, arranging a gathering that felt more like genuine warmth than the kind of performative grandeur that had characterized so many of the formal occasions she remembered from her earliest years of marriage. She found herself, moving through the assembled guests that afternoon, greeted with a respect considerably different from the polite, distant courtesy she had grown accustomed to receiving in her earlier years at Bennington House. Neighboring families who had once regarded her as pleasant but unremarkable, now approached with genuine curiosity, having heard, through the inevitable channels of county gossip, some version of the truth behind the estate's recent troubles and their equally recent resolution. Lady Ashworth, an older widow who had known the Bennington family for decades and who possessed a reputation for blunt, unsentimental honesty, cornered Elara near the refreshment table partway through the afternoon, studying her with frank, appraising interest. "I confess, Your Grace, I always thought you rather quiet for a duchess," Lady Ashworth said, without any particular unkindness. "Now I understand you were simply quiet about the right things, while the rest of us were busy being loud about matters of considerably less consequence. I find I owe you a reconsideration of my earlier judgment." Elara accepted this with the same steady grace she had learned, over difficult years, to carry through far less generous assessments. "I have found, Lady Ashworth, that quiet and unremarkable are not always the same thing, however easily the two get confused." "No," Lady Ashworth agreed, with a small, approving nod. "I am beginning to understand that rather thoroughly myself." As the afternoon wore into evening, and the gathering began, gradually, to disperse toward carriages waiting in the drive, Elara found a quiet moment alone near the edge of the garden, watching the last guests depart with a satisfaction that surprised her in its steadiness. She had spent 5 years believing herself invisible in this house, valued for nothing beyond quiet compliance, and she found now, standing at the center of an afternoon organized specifically to acknowledge everything she had once done in complete secrecy, that the old wound of those years had not vanished entirely, but had settled, at last, into something she could carry without it constantly aching. Alaric joined her as the final carriage rolled away down the long drive, offering no words at first, simply standing beside her in the gathering dusk with an ease that had grown, slowly and deliberately, over the months since that first difficult reckoning. "You seemed, this afternoon, rather more at peace than I have seen you in longer than I care to admit," he said finally. "I am beginning to be, Alara said, and found the words entirely true as she spoke them. It takes time, I have learned, to trust that a thing once broken has been genuinely mended, rather than simply patched over for the sake of easier appearances. But I believe, watching this house these past months, that the mending here has been genuine. I intend it to remain so, Alaric said, for as long as you will allow me the chance to prove it. She looked at him a long moment in the fading light. 5 years of quiet endurance and months of careful, honest rebuilding settled now into something that felt, for the first time and longer than she could easily remember, like genuine partnership rather than lonely obligation. Then let us go in, she said finally. There is still work to finish before supper, and I find, these days, that I rather enjoy having someone willing to sit beside me while I do it. They walked back together toward the lit windows of the house, the estate settling into its evening quiet around them, its finances honest now, its household finally seeing clearly the woman who had quietly held it together through its most difficult years. Alara Whitmore, once dismissed before that very household as a wife who had given her house nothing, walked at her husband's side toward a home finally willing to see her plainly, exactly as she had always deserved to be seen.